Samalio Pardulus by Otto Julius Bierbaum. So, Otto Julius Bierbaum was a German writer active, I believe, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. I am not really familiar at all with his work because I believe at present this is actually the only of his works to have been translated into English. So I'm not going to say too much on him. You can look into him and his work on your own if you would like. If you speak German, he may very well be a writer worth looking into. I don't know. But this little book, Samalio Pardulus, and it is little, it is a novella only about 60 odd pages in length, is, I think you might say, a big thing in a small package because despite its brevity, it really packed a punch, or at least it did for me. It is a book which I found very, very gripping and also very, very intriguing as well. So, what is this book about? Well, it is told largely through the eyes of a man named Giacomo. Giacomo is an artist who has been hired to instruct the titular character Samalio Pardulus in art, to teach him how to paint and stuff. Samalio Pardulus is the son of a lord in, I believe, the Albanian mountains. He's kind of from like an old stock family of nobility, kind of. But he is hideously ugly. But he has a sister who is radiantly beautiful. But he wants to paint, so this guy Giacomo was hired to come teach him to paint. But he quickly becomes appalled at the paintings which Samalio produces, which are incredibly blasphemous and sacrilegious. And this kind of creates friction between Giacomo and Samalio because Samalio espouses some very, very outre theological views, whereas Giacomo is very, very devoutly Christian. And so eventually Giacomo leaves Samalio in his remote castle in the mountains and returns to the domain of his father, the Lord. And his father is trying to arrange a marriage for his daughter and another nobleman. But it would appear that Samalio may also be a practitioner of the dark arts, and he also is infatuated incestuously with his own beautiful sister, and so he sends an incubus nightly to seduce her. And so eventually she is corrupted by Samalio, and he kind of absconds with her. And so the Lord and Giacomo and some of the Lord's men saddle up to go kill Samalio for what has been done to his sister and the Lord's daughter, only to find that Samalio and his sister are both already dead. And then the Lord, their father, apparently becomes, I guess, possessed and kind of rattles off some very cryptic lines. And then the book just ends with Giacomo renouncing his own artistry because he believes that art is the worst snare of evil. And so that's the book. That's the story of Samalio Pardulus. Now, this book I found very, very interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because of the kind of theological angle of it, and also, two, because it kind of feels like two different stories welded together. So the first half of this book, and that's kind of odd because this book is so short. It's only, again, like 60 odd pages. But the first half of this book, I guess the first 30 or so pages, has no real plot to speak of and is just Samalio Pardulus painting very blasphemous images and then kind of spouting some wild theological views to Giacomo. And it on the back of this book here, it says that when it was first published, Otto Julius Bierbaum's 1908 Gothic novella offered a Gnostic stepping stone between German Romanticism and the nascent Expressionism that had not yet taken root. So this is a work of Gothic fiction. It's a work of Gothic horror. But it also, as mentioned on the back cover, contains elements of, I guess, what you would call Gnosticism, even though I personally found the kind of theological elements at play in this book to be much more reminiscent kind of Philip Mainlander's philosophy, if you're familiar with that figure. He had some interesting ideas about the nature of God, which seem to kind of, to me at least, line up with those espoused by the titular character in Samalio Pardulus, because, like Nietzsche is the one who coined the phrase God is dead. But according to Samalio Pardulus, that is not a metaphor, but actually quite literal. That God literally died to spawn the universe, and the kind of logic that he uses to back that up is that if God is perfection, then the most perfect thing, the thing that is truly incorruptible and untarnishable, would be nothing. So God, according to this kind of dark theology, is literally nothing, and that the universe, all that exists, is kind of the corpse of God, I suppose. Anyway, it's wild. It's very again outre, but I found it highly interesting. And again, it's kind of I mean, if you're into kind of like Gnostic stuff, I guess this might really scratch that itch, because it definitely offers some interesting viewpoints. I'll say that. But anyway, and so that's like the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book is basically just kind of a straightforward Gothic horror story of this beautiful young woman being corrupted by an incubus sent by her hideous and lustful brother. And then again, their father, after discovering their corpses in Somalio's castle, becomes possessed, I guess, and kind of he says some very cryptic things, which I was not able really to make sense of. But that's the story. And again, it's remarkable to me just because it feels like two different things fused together. Some kind of strange treatise on theology, and then a kind of just a Gothic horror story. But I thought it worked. I mean, it may feel a little disjointed, but like it was never boring. I will say that this kept me hooked all the way through. I was really kind of turning the pages here with avidity, because I found the strange tale of Samalio Pardulus to be quite compelling, really. But now, this book also features illustrations throughout by Alfred Cuban. And if you don't know who that is, Alfred Cuban was himself the author of one book, at least, which is The Other Side. If you've ever heard of this book, Alfred Cuban was an illustrator, an artist himself, but he also did write this book called The Other Side, and you can look into that if you would like. But anyway, so Samalio Pardulus has some pretty sick illustrations throughout it, which really added to the effects, I thought. Kind of created a nice ambiance to the story. I really liked it. So let's talk about the technical aspects of this book. The writing is good. I think Otto Julius Bierbaum, judging only by this one brief work of his that I read, I'd say he was a pretty good writer, because I thought the prose in this was fine. It was a pretty well written book. Not much to complain about there. Now the characters, there's not much in the way of characters, because again of just how thin this is. But Samalio Pardulus, the title character, is certainly memorable just because of how strange and kind of menacing he is. Again, has some very unique outlooks on things, I would say, theologically speaking. And Giacomo, again, very, very pious, very, very devout, and it's kind of the foil to Samalio. So it's kind of a contrast between piety and heresy and such. It worked. It was enough. These aren't the deepest characters, but they do kind of they work well enough for the story. They're striking enough in their personalities to be somewhat memorable anyway. So for the size of this book, I think it did actually pretty well in that regard. And the story, once again, it feels kind of like two stories stuck together, but it was interesting all the way. I thought it was a wild ride, and it kept me turning the pages. And it's also kind of thought provoking in some ways. But yeah, so it's basically a work of gothic horror, but with some Gnostic uh, undertones to it, if that's what you want to call it. And so I think, if I may coin a new term here, we may, or I may denote Samalio Pardulus as being a Gothic masterpiece, a Gnostic Gothic novel, a Gothic masterpiece. That is what I would call this because I thought this book kicked ass. I liked it. So to rate Samalio Pardulus, I'm gonna give it, I think, a B plus. The characters are, while I think it did good enough, there isn't a lot there, and I think that some people might not like how the story feels a little disjointed, and I can see that being kind of perceived as maybe a flaw with it, even though for me it was fine. But I think overall I'm gonna rate this just as a solid B plus, almost like teetering on the edge of A minus territory. I just love the heck out of this little book. It was surprising. It's a very, 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 very underrated gem, I would say, because this is, at least in the English speaking world, this is a very unknown, obscure kind of work. And I'm very glad that I came across it because it was well worth reading for me anyway, I think. So yeah, Samalio Pardulus, a Gothic masterpiece, if I do say so myself. So have you read Samalio Pardulus? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said about it here today. And if you haven't read Samalio Pardulus, I could really recommend picking this up if you want something brief, but something that may stick with you. Like I said, it really packs a punch, and I thought it kicked ass. So yeah, this, I could definitely recommend this. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.